Hi everyone, I'm Hsing-ay. Welcome to the Nutmeg studio in New York City. So excited to have Hyeyung here with us. Hyeyung Yoon is the founder and organizer of Asian Musical Voices of America, devoted to community building and activism for transformational change among self-identified Asian Americans working and creating in classical music. How are you, Hyeyung?
Nice to see you. Thank you for having me.
There's a lot of new projects that you and your husband, Greg Beaver, are involved in together. How much of your projects are you guys collaborating on?
I'm familiar with collaborating a lot with Greg because we were in the same string quartet, the Kiara String Quartet, for over 18 years of our
Award
lives.
winning string quartet.
Award winning. Okay, thank you. Um, we're used to collaborating with each other. Actually, since the quartet had its final season in 2018, we've been playing a lot of duos and piano trios. He wrote me a violin cello duo as a composer as well. And when the pandemic hit, we actually collaborated to start a online concert series called Open Space Music. We presented over 35 events online with many artists who are playing, performing, and sharing their music. And we were able to pay the artists through ticket sales. And it was a really fun way to spend the pandemic in the uncertainty of a pandemic, to be able to still gather people and for artists to just hear music and share that, which was a blessing. So, yeah, so we do collaborate a lot. Right now, most of the organizing for open space music is done by me because Greg is he's, aside from being a musician, he's also a brilliant computer programmer. So I've been spending most of the work that open space music has needed. I've been doing the organizing, which has been a lot of fun too.
Along with raising two beautiful girls.
Yes, along with raising two beautiful girls, two beautiful daughters, and yeah, and I think the balance is always, it's never there. I think somebody has called it life Jenga, instead of life balance, work life balance, work life Jenga. I think that's a
Yes.
more apt term. I practice, create music to be shared,
Mm-hmm.
so I think that, whenever I'm playing a concert, preparing for a concert, um, that concert is community outreach. So, so I think that, a lot of, I think in folks in the classical music world, we think of community outreach as being separate from performances or separate from concerts, the regular concerts.
Mm-hmm.
But I think more that, um, even with I mean, the history, I can kind of go into the history of like what I've done before, but I was in a string quartet for a long time with the Kiara String Quartet for 18 years. And over the course of our 18-year career, that line between community outreach and concerts, it's not clear. I mean, it blends into each other, and it's the same, I think. Our mission, our goal is to share music, right? With the musicians, right? Develop like long-term, deep relationship with the musicians and the community. That's the goal, ultimate goal, right? But we're also fledgling. We also just started, right? So this idea of building community is a big question that we have to kind of answer in the next few years. So I'm excited to start it. And we're going to start with just this project called MaDang project. And MaDang is a very special personal word to me because it's a Korean word. I'm a Korean American. And the word means literally an open space in the middle of a village, like a Korean village.
Mm-hmm.
But this open space is where a lot of the performances and rituals and meetings happen. So the MaDang, this word, what's really amazing about it is that it can literally mean that open space, right? Physical space, but it can also transcend that to mean a space where, all can gather to express freely. So I went to Korea actually for a few months with my daughter. We took a trip just around the Lunar New Year time, and we got to see uh, different madang performances take place in Korea, and we went to a lot of like shaman rituals that also took place. And this, what I saw was that in madang performances, it's usually done in a round, in a circle, and in a society that's very marked by patriarchy and class and all those things, with women and men being separate, old and young being separate in a lot of spaces. In the madang space, everybody just kind of sits around together, mixed all together. Women have a really powerful role in a madang performance, and there's this kind of freedom that comes out. So, there are musicians who are, in quote, performers, right, who might play drums and who might play different wind instruments, reed instruments. But in a badang performance, there are times when actually the musicians move outside the circle, and the audience or the participants, they kind of come in the circle, and then the musicians surround them. So this is a time when the audience can sing and dance and be joyful. So in that situation, there's no clear line between performers, artists, and just participants who come to listen and watch the concert, watch the performance.
Are these folk songs that you're talking about that everyone already knows and shares a knowledge of?
I was in a village of Pilbong, which is in the southern region of Korea. And it's a village that has transmitted, or kind of this kind of farmers' percussion music for generations. And it almost got lost. It almost got lost after the Korean War, this kind of tradition. But the government actually since then have tried to revive it and to subsidize these villages from enduring and surviving, right? So I think the villagers, or the villagers who live there, are paid a subsidy by the government to keep living in that village and to keep practicing this art. So they have these big festivals, I think twice a year, one in the summer and one in the winter. So I got to go to the one that happened around Lunar New Year, and it was the 대보름 축제, which is the great full moon. So the musicians, and these are just like amazing artists, and they've been practicing this art for their entire lives. They started the music at around 10 a.m. and they played in the cold for almost 12 hours. I could not believe it. I could not believe it. It was incredible. It seems to my ears that a lot of it is improvised, but it's not actually, you know? So all the rhythms, all the patterns, all the ritual steps that happen throughout the day, it's all have been done. They all have been done before, and they keep doing it.
So, is there kind of an element of endurance for everyone?
Yes, yes,
And
definitely.
do
I
you
feel
stop
like
to
that's
eat?
I think like I feel like okay, so two things that are very Korean:
Uh-huh.
endurance,
Yeah.
keep going through suffering, through sadness, through all these things,
Okay.
but you have to eat.
Yeah.
Eating is so important. There was a lunch break and a dinner break, and the village fed everybody for free. And then these are like the ajummas and 할머니들, which are like aunties and grandmothers who live in the village, right? They were cooking, for 2 days straight before then. It was so amazing to actually like bring Nuri, our daughter, with me. She turned to me at the end when the bonfire was going, and she said, I don't think I will ever experience anything like this again. You know, she was like, this is a special, special experience. I was like, yep, you're right. I mean, it was incredible. Yeah. I didn't know that I was going to experience these things. And there were, you know, and I just put myself into that situation and things started to happen. And, you know, and I'm very fortunate. And you're absolutely right that a lot of the people, most people in Korea would not have experienced anything like this, even though they live in Korea.
It
Right.
seems to me that because we have immigrated out of our native countries, that we
Yeah.
have some sort of, what's the word, a special interest to figure out our identities in the midst of a larger world, a larger global context, maybe. And so it's always fascinating to me how your Koreanness then gets used in the way that you show up in the US, in this country. So, one of the ways that you're doing that is to get the concept of this community coming together into an ongoing series on your platform online. And by being online, you're able to reach a much greater distance of people. Um, Now, in terms of this coherence, you're talking about uh, being inspired by something where everyone locally seems to understand how things go and how things are. Does that translate as you're trying to create something completely new?
Right. And I think that's a big question that I'm asking myself and I want to answer, right? Keep answering in different ways.
And part of how people are known is through the trauma that they have survived. And it's a really difficult situation in which how do you how do you write a history and how do you pass on a story when part of the story also digs up a lot of feelings that are trying really hard to be buried.
Yeah.
So
I haven't really talked about this very often, so it'll be good for me to talk about it too. Um, so, you know, my parents grew up post-war Korea, right? And, you know, at that time, as you can imagine, very, very chaotic and very challenging. And actually, I'm starting to find out more about it right now because I'm reading this poetry book that won the National Book Award last year. It's called DMZ Colony by Tom Miche. But that also talks about post-war Korea and what sort of things happened. And you know, I'm reading this book and I'm thinking, wait a minute, my parents were teenagers. Wait, my parents were, you know, in their 20s, you know, when they were experiencing all these things, you know, through dictatorships, through student protests for democracy, and you know, so many kind of upheavals that were going on at that time. You know, imprisonment, freedom of the press was, you know, just like squashed and all those things. But anyway, so the students, what they did during this time period, which is like pretty amazing, was that they used Madang performances to um, to protest and to communicate their message to fellow Koreans because it was a way to do it where it wasn't so obvious. This idea of Madang, I think, was really romanticized among the students during that time period, right? This kind of like equality, right? So to my parents who grew up in that era, this word "badang" was very, very, you know, special, and they felt very passionate about it. So they actually, you know, as immigrants to the United States, they lived in North Carolina for a long time. They owned the dry cleaners for like 30 years, and they just retired actually. But, you know, amongst the Korean immigrants, immigrant community, they formed a club or like a group of people, Korean immigrants, to come together monthly to read books together, to read poetry together, and to share music together, right? And they call this group Norum Madang, which means like wide open space. To and it's this idea that no matter who you are, you're welcome in this space. So it's a really beautiful idea. So yeah, so I think, you know, for me, you know, I have this history with my parents. I have this history as a Korean American. I live in the United States, obviously, right, which is very different from Korea. I'm removed from there. These are the things that I hold dear, right? And these are the things that are important to me, right? And these are the things that I can share. Making sure that even when you look like this, as an obvious Asian American or Asian woman, right? Whether you are, Korean, whether you are, you know, Black, whether you are Latinx, whether you are all these different identity and cultures, that you belong in classical music, that you are you with all of yourself, like all the things that you have, you belong here.
In the ideal world that you're trying to build and the awareness you're trying to build, how would that look to you?
I'm reminded of this podcast interview that I heard of Ocean Vuong, who is a poet writer, and he was talking about how there is a difference between representation and presence, right? And how he described it was that, when you're being represented, right, this is when you are seen on stage. And, we see many East Asians in the string section, right, in the orchestra, right? And it's like, and we can say, oh, yeah, Asians are totally represented in classical music. They're totally fine, right? But then you start to look at the presence part of it, right? And you start looking at the leadership or the board or the people who are actually making decisions or making artistic artistic acts within or decisions within the field, right? And you see that it's white male dominated. The culture favors white. What would it look like if the classical music world had presence of Asians, BIPOC, people of color, whatever term that you want to use, all these people in the presence of the field.
So, in terms of concert music, you're thinking about what is the
Mm-hmm.
future of a concert music tradition that is based on a Western tonal system, but now in a country where we have a lot of
Yeah.
diversity, you're looking to the future to say, and now we have music that represents a more global direction. Am I following? Is that what you're
Sure. Yeah.
saying?
So one example that I can give from my own life is that I actually, after my last season with the Chiara Quartet, I decided for myself that I would no longer play program that has only white male composers on the program, right? So that probably means for me that I actually had to turn down some gigs because of that, right? Because I knew that the kind of the venue or kind of the concert series that they would not be open to that suggestion. So I had to say no to it, right? So so that's a conscious decision that I have made for my own self. Programming is actually changing a lot, which is really amazing. What I would love to see is that the standard is multicultural and multi-ethnic, right? So
Yeah.
that you're able to, that's the normal, that's the baseline.
Going back to what you were saying about understanding the difference between optics and presence in belonging,
Right.
how can you help us to understand how this ties in? Because I think for some people it would feel like optics, like one piece in every program is a measurement that is an external measurement, right?
Yeah, I think both need to happen, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's not one or the other, but I do think that if presence is multi-ethnic, is multicultural, and that's the standard, that's like what we expect, that I think the programming will follow. That's my feeling, but I'm not really sure. But I would guess that would happen because you will have people who have different experiences, right?
Mm-hmm.
Working on these things, working on programming, working on, I don't know, gathering a community together, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and I just want to also, mention that, with my now, 18-year career with the Chiara Quartet and also 20 somewhat years, over 20 years, of my career being a violinist, being a musician, professional musician, I would say that about 90% of the concerts that I played, maybe even more actually, right? That the audience was mostly white, right? Mostly white audience, and the presenters were mostly white also. I don't think, and that's not kind of the environment that I want to create in, that I want to share in. Not that I have anything against white people. I'm married to a white people white person, but it's not about that. But I think that for me, I do want to share in a community. The community I want to build and I want to share in is a multicultural, multi-ethnic one. So
Has your change in programming direction been able to draw in people who are not ordinary concert goers?
I think that for right now, what I'm questioning is the ordinary concert, that concept, right? Because the way that I experienced music in Korea was very, very different, right? The environment that I experienced at it was very different. And, I think that if, if you were to listen to folk music in the context of the concert hall, that's not going to work. I mean, it has been done. It's like really exciting, but it's just not the same. One activity that we did with Open Space Music was during the summer. We did we partnered with an organization called Homecoming, New York City, and it's an organization based in Queens, and they do a food crawl, actually in different neighborhoods of Queens. So last year they did a food crawl in Elmhurst, Queens, and then this year they did one in Jackson Heights. And basically, what happens is that people buy tickets to have a tasting at about 5 local restaurants. But I think it's the one of the most diverse, ethnically diverse places in the world, actually, right? So, these restaurants were, so at the end of each food crawl, there was like a mini concert that happened right afterwards. Greg and I played, my husband and I played. We played some Ravel and we played some music that was actually written by Greg. We also played some Amy Beach's music. Um, so it was really, yeah, it was a lot of fun, and there was also a duo, like a vocal and piano duo that played some jazz kind of improvisation things, but they also um, sang more older, like an opera aria. People who came were ethnically very diverse, and it was really fun. It was really great, and we gave to the community
That's
because
wonderful.
the proceeds went to a local food bank. So there was like a really nice example of how, music and also community work could be in the same plane, right, in the same space.
Let's go on to the economics of it, because to have really good tech, to have good amplification, to be able to organize the administrative part of it, it all requires time and money. And so, what is your vision for where we're headed in the future? How we can support musicians when everyone's used to things being free on YouTube and community things being free events? How do we get there?
I think that because of the kind of society that we live in, that it's often easy to it's easy for me, and I'm sure for a lot of people, to base your success on how much funding you get or what kind of budget what an organization has, right? So if it's a bigger budget, you're more successful. For AMVA, a lot of the work that's been done is through volunteer work, right? So that's like a very special situation where I do think it's more kind of um, people are just getting together to try this thing. And, I have like 5 organizers who are working with me, and they're all invested in the work and they do what they can. I do what I can, right? So and we all care about it deeply. But at a certain point, I do think I would love to move the platform into or an organization where I can pay. We're kind of in phase 1, I guess, right? We're not thinking about that right now. It's more about building community. That's the goal for AMVA. For open space music, the first year was so different. A lot of the funds that were used that we used to pay our artists and all those things were through ticket sales, actually. We made, and we were like very successful, and we made enough money to be able to pay our artists a good fee, right? Throughout the whole thing, which is really amazing. But now it's coming going into a kind of a different direction. So I have to be thinking about how what kind of budget I want to work with. Um, but you know, for me, um, with the starting projects that I'm starting, kind of small, right? So that we can build from it, so that it's something that it's a budget that I can manage. I have some money kind of saved up from the past projects of open space music, because we actually help some other organizations with their online programming, also consulting, and yeah, and doing some work for others. Yeah. Well, I've started thinking about already, applying for grants, applying for funding in different ways. But I think the biggest thing is to build a community around it who believe in the work, so that we are able to build a culture where people are willing to say, okay, this is giving to me, I want to give to it too.
When you were talking about, encouraging people to give and take, I think that that is a kind of a great antidote for the capitalist mentality, that this is where you can find your identity by what you're able to contribute. Then there is more, you enjoy more connection because you're able to contribute as well. You're nurturing that alternative way of thinking about how to be in the community. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah.
Great. So you are part of a panel that's an important panel about Asian American presence in our society at the upcoming Chamber Music America virtual conference.
Hmm.
And the title of your panel is Asians in Western Classical Music, Resisting White Adjacency and Building Coalitions. So can you explain to us what white adjacency means?
I want to also talk about what white adjacency means to Asian Americans historically too. I think it's more structural than just my own experience. There's a term called model minority. Um, and for those who are not familiar with this term, it's a term that has been historically used to describe Asians as these hardworking, they pulled their, bootstraps up, and they just got to work. And even though they faced racism, they were able to, be successful. The problem is that that kind of image of Asian Americans have been used to drive a wedge between African Americans and Asian Americans in this country historically, right? So it has been used by the government actually to say to African American communities, you are not working hard enough. Look at the Asian people, right? They're successful. Why are you not successful, right? And to take funding away from those communities. It continues to happen, actually. I think for me, this idea of Asians being quiet, right? And not speaking their minds, and just, keeping heads down and working hard, right? So that's actually the kind of image that I had in my head of Asians in this country generally, and for myself too, right? So, when there was a question about, like, why are there not, why are the Asians the least likely to be promoted to executive positions, right? Which is actually a fact. Um, so when I see that, when I saw that in the past, I will be like, well, Asians are kind of quiet, and we don't want to be put in a place, we're kind of raised to be quiet, so we don't do that. But I've since, kind of after learning about this, since have really questioned that idea of Asians, being, keeping our heads down and just doing whatever we can to work hard and to be successful. I reject that idea. I reject that for myself too. So I think this wide adjacency, because of what historically have been kind of narrated to us as our story, that we just go along with things, that we're okay with the system. That's why this kind of this title came up, resisting white adjacency, because I think also that a lot of people you know see Asians, and they think they're different, but they're almost they enjoy the same kinds of things as white people, which is actually not true. Which is actually not true. That wasn't the true for myself when I was growing up. That wasn't true for myself when I was in my career as a violinist. That was not true. Um, so yeah, so I think resisting white agents is, resisting that and claiming for myself, yes, I'm Asian. I'm in the classical music world. I'm not white. I'm not white, right? I identify with people of color, right? Because I am a person of color. I identify with the struggles that, my fellow Black musicians are facing, right? Or my Latinx musicians are fellow musicians are facing. I also identify with, you know, non-East Asian Asians, right? Who are, definitely not represented at all in the classical music field. I also identify with their struggles too. So that's kind of how I define resisting white adjacency, right? In that way, I want the Asians that I'm working with to identify with other people of color.
What in the past made you realize that this is something going on?
I have to say, I was sheltered a lot because I was in a string quartet and there were just four of us working together, and um, we we worked together, full time. So it was always within the quartet context. I do think that, when every time I'm placed in a situation, like a new situation, I know that I have to be very aware of how I am viewed as an Asian woman violinist, right? Because I know that a lot of times people see me, and just by looking at me, my physical features, they assume a set of expectations that they have, right? That I'm going to be quiet, right? That I'm going to be docile, that I'm going to be, just kind of agree with everything and just be easygoing, right? So I know that for myself, I'm not that. I'm not that personality, right? And I have to resist that. In the past, when I've been put into a situation where I don't know the people that I'm working with, I've overreacted and been probably not myself when, I would just kind of be very aggressive or be very, try to not be that as much as, like, be far from that as much as possible. But I know that that's also not the answer, right? And I think that when I'm walking into a situation that's new to me, right, I have to always make sure that I'm strong in who I am, right? Who I know who I am, right? And just be that, and no more and no less.